In the last lecture, we've seen how can we program our smart contract to hold an Ether balance. Now, let's see how can we access the contract balance. How can we transfer Ether from our contract to another address, a contract address or an user address. There are two functions. Every address variable has a transfer function and a send function. These functions are used to transfer Ether from the contract. It is recommended to use the transfer function. Let's go to our example and let's create a function named transfer balance. This function has one argument. This is the address that receives the Ether from our contract. So let's say recipient address. Our function is public. This means that it can be called from another application. This doesn't mean that anyone can access our contract balance. We'll have a test and only the owner will be able to access the contract balance. Recipient address dot transfer, and now the amount I want to transfer. Let's say amount. And here I have another argument named amount. So our function has two arguments, the address that receives the Ether and the amount of Ether that will be sent. That amount will be specified in ways. So unsigned integer amount. Somebody could try to send an amount that is greater than the contract balance. So we must test that this amount that will be sent is less than or equal to the contract balance. So if amount less than or equal to get balance, the value returned by this function. So if this test is true, then I call this function. Else return false. I add here return true because my function will return true or false. True if the amount of Ether has been successfully transferred, and false otherwise. And here I must specify returns bool. Let's deploy this contract on Ringby test network. So we press here on deploy. The MetaMask window appears. It's very important to be already authenticated in MetaMask. Otherwise, here we'll get an error. And I submit the transaction. I wait for this transaction to be mined. It will be ready in a few seconds. The contract has been mined. And now back on Remix Editor, I will send some Ether to my contract. It doesn't matter what account sends Ether. I'll send from MetaMask. This account has 3.897 Ether. I have more accounts here. This account has no Ether. So I'll send some Ether from this account. So send. I need a contract address. This is the contract address. I'll copy this address to clipboard. And now back on MetaMask, recipient address, and I'll send 0.1 Ether. Next. And submit. Okay, this is my transaction. And I wait for this transaction to be mined. The transaction has been mined. And now back on Remix Editor, I load the contract from that address, my new contract. And I call the function getBalance. I want to see the balance. Our contract has received 0.1 Ether. This is in way here. Okay. And now I want to transfer this amount of Ether to another address. Let's take another address from MetaMask. It can be any kind of address. It could be a contract address or a user address. So here I have my second account that has a balance of 0 Ether. I copy the address to clipboard, and here back on Remix editor I will transfer to this address, let's say, this amount of Ether, so the entire balance. Transfer balance, MetaMask window appears, and submit. This is my transaction here. I wait for the transaction to be mined. It has been mined. Back on MetaMask, I want to check the balance of the second account. As you can see, we have 0.1 Ether. So the entire balance has been transferred to this account. This is the way we access and transfer the contract balance to another account. But here is a problem. Here is a very important security problem. Anyone in the world could transfer the contract balance to his own Ethereum address. So this is not okay. We want, for example, that only the owner of the contract or only the administrator of this contract to be able to access the contract balance. First of all, here I have a variable, a public variable named owner. And using the constructor of the contract, I set the owner with the address that deploys the contract. So the account that deploys the contract will be the owner. And this owner can't be changed after that because there is no method that changes the owner. So here inside this function, I must check that the person that calls this function, the transfer balance function, is the owner. Otherwise, I return. So if msg.sender, this is the person or the contract, so the Ethereum address that calls this function is the owner. I like to use indentation for my code, and I advise you to do the same because this way your code will be more understandable. Else if msg.sender is not the owner, return false. Now only the owner can access the contract balance. Let's test it. Let's deploy the contract one more time. Submit. And it has been mined. First, I must send some Ether to my new contract. So I copy the contract address from etherscan.io. This is my new contract. Copy. And using MetaMask, I send some Ether. The amount of 0.3 Ether. As usually, I wait for the transaction to be mined. And the transaction has been mined. So first of all, I delete all these deployments from here, and I want to load my new contract here in Remix. I want to check its balance. Get balance. This is the contract balance as we expected. And now I want to call the transfer balance function from another account. So another account, not the owner, wants to transfer the entire contract balance to his own address, for example. So let's change here the account that will execute this function, that will call this function. In order to do this, I go to MetaMask and I select the second account. This is the second account. And back to Remix editor, I must refresh the browser for my new account to appear here in this area. Remix loaded and the contract has been compiled. And now on the Run tab, I load the contract using its address. This is the contract address. I check its balance and its owner. And the owner of the contract that has been set using the constructor starts, so the address of the owner starts with C7. the account that will execute the transfer balance function is another account, is not the owner. So starts with 4, 6, 5 and so on. So using this account, I want to transfer the entire contract balance, let's say, to the third account from MetaMask, so to a third-party Ethereum address. So let's copy the address to clipboard. Copy to clipboard. Okay. And now here I want to transfer the entire balance to this address. I copy paste the contract balance, and now I execute the function. We see that this transaction will be executed from the second account. It's important, this account, to have an amount of Ether because it must pay gas. And I submit the transaction. This is the transaction. And the transaction has been mined. Okay, now we go back to the Remix editor. What should have happened? Because our transaction has been executed by another account, not by the owner, so msg.sender wasn't the owner, my function returned here. This is the instruction that has been executed. So if I check on MetaMask, the balance of the third account is still 0. So the account didn't receive any Ether. We can see it's 0. As a conclusion, if we want to ensure that no one can access the balance of our contract, we register the owner using the constructor, like here, and when we transfer the amount of Ether from the contract balance to another account, to another address, we check that the account that calls that function, that executes the transaction, is the owner. Using this test, msg.sender, this is the person that executes the transaction, must be equal to the owner.